Hey, everybody. Really pleased to be here. My name is Nick Hamilton. I'm the director of the East Asia program at Cornell University, if you're coming from somewhere else. And I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Dr. Wagwan Lim. Professor Lim's visit has been funded and supported by the East Asia program, including Wei Ming and Sydney, who are here by the Department of Asian Studies, Cornell's Department of Asian Studies, and by the Taiwan Economic Cooperation Office in New York City. And we're pleased to be able to bring him from quite a long way, but he doesn't seem tired, to come here. Wagwan is an associate professor at the Guoli Zhongxing Daxue, the National Zhongxing University in Taiwan, in Taichung, Taiwan. He is an alumni of our own Asian Studies program, from which he graduated in 2000. And has been named, I think last year was named a Yushan Scholar in the Taiwanese academic system, which is a great honor and which we are all extremely pleased to hear. He gave my son his Chinese name, for which I don't thank him often enough. Yeah, it's just in the back. So you mostly know him. I'm just going to let him talk about his new book, Denationalizing Identities, which is incidentally, if you're coming from online or if you've never seen a Cornell East Asia series book before, this is what they look like. They're really nice. And Vaughn is one of our early adopters of the new format of the Cornell East Asia series book design, and that's the book he's going to talk about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that nice introduction. Thank you to Sydney and Wei Ming for all the organizational, admin, and logistics support. Thank you to the East Asia program and the Southeast Asia program for bringing me here. And thank you to the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Office for sponsoring my trip. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. This truly is homecoming for me. This year marks the 10th year of my graduation from Cornell. I have been here in this room countless times as a graduate student, organizing events, to esteemed scholars that we welcome from elsewhere. And never could I imagine one day I'll be standing at this platform addressing all of you in person. It already is my third academic job after graduation. My first was at upstate New York in a liberal arts college. I then moved back to my alma mater in Australia, in Sydney, and I'm now in Taichung, Taiwan. And these cross-continental moves may seem very unsettling and tired, yet the trip has been immensely rewarding. And this journey couldn't have begun without my training that I received here at Cornell. It is customary, as all of you know, for PhD students at Cornell to have three faculty members to be on your special committee from different disciplines to help you. Because I'm such a poor student, I have double that number. Of my 6 members in the special committee, my co-chairs, Professor Ed Gan, who is the pioneering scholar of modern Chinese drama, Professor Stephen Sangren, Chinese anthropologist. They have both retired. Patrice Liu in comparative literature, Lorraine Patterson in Southeast Asia have not continued at Cornell. And my last 2 members from the Department of Theatre, Film and Dance, Don Fredrickson, the film scholar, he's now in heaven, smiling at us, watching over us, and Sarah Warner, who is with us today in theatre and performance. They form the core of my intellectual growth at Cornell and beyond. And this book couldn't have happened without them. And I dedicate this talk to all of them. My talk today will be in 2 parts. First, I'll give you an overall view, an overarching view of my book, and then I'll hone into one particular chapter to give you a sense of how I structure the book. My book, Denationalizing Identities, The Politics of Performance in the Chinese Diaspora, is a study of global Chinese theater, where I explore how drama and performance participated in identity formation in the 1980s across the Chinese-speaking world. The 1980s was an important decade for understanding global Chinese theater. This period saw the rise of the professional careers of four important ethnic Chinese dramatists: Kuo Pao Kun, Stan Lai, Gao Xingjian, and Danny Yung, whose efforts shaped the contemporary Chinese theater scenes across Singapore, Taiwan, China, and Hong Kong. Now, from this slide, you might observe two very interesting things. The first is their romanizations. You can see in Cornell, what we teach is the standard Hanyu pinyin, which is what they use in mainland China starting from the 1950s. In Taiwan, Stan Lai, you can see the hyphen in his name. That's the Wei Zhao's system of romanization. In Kuo Pao Kun's case in Singapore, the ethnic Chinese the names are romanized according to their dialect groups. So if your surname is Chen or Dong Chen, for instance, in Hanyu Pinyin is Chen. If you're a Cantonese speaker in Singapore, your surname will be Chan, Chan. And if you're from Teochew, Chaozhou, or Hokkien, Fujian background, your surname will be Dan, Tan. And lastly, in the case of Hong Kong, in Hong Kong, most names are romanized according to the Cantonese pronunciation. And this man, Rong Nian Zeng, his name pronounced in Cantonese is Weng Nin Zhang. And this name, Yung Ning Tsun, doesn't look anything like Weng Nin Zhang, does it? Yung Ning Tsun actually betrays Danny's Shanghainese upbringing. He was born in Shanghai and moved to Hong Kong in 1948. So he came at a time before things were standardized. And by giving you a preface of this, what I'm trying to say is that not all Chinese are the same. And I'm here trying to debunk the myth of a unified Chineseness. The second interesting thing that you can observe are their dates of birth. You can see that Kuo Pao Kun, Gao Xingjian, and Danny Yung are all born around the 1940s. And Stan Lai is born around the mid-1950s. So they are about 15 years apart. Yet their professional careers all peaked at the same time in the 1980s. Well, there are two possible readings to this, why that is the case. A is that Stan Lai is a child prodigy and the other three are late bloomers for their careers to all peak at the same time. And the other is that there are some external forces impacting the entire region in the same temporality. My research supports the latter. How do I move to next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This gives you a visual mapping of the areas I'm talking about. When I meant global Chinese drama, I'm really talking about these four sites in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. These four sites with a majority of ethnic Chinese. In large part prompted by changes in regional geopolitics, the search for a local identity peaked among the Chinese communities in East and Southeast Asia. During the Cold War, the world was divided into two, between the free world led by US and its allies and the communist bloc led by Russia and its allies. The bamboo curtain, the imaginary division, divided the two Chinas across the Taiwan Straits. Like there's an imaginary line right here dividing the two Chinas, free China and communist China. It is known as Two Chinese because both China and Taiwan retained the word China in their official names. And the Cold War also impacted the two former British colonies of Singapore and Hong Kong in a way that resulted in a re-signification and eventual handover of Hong Kong to China and a clampdown on Chinese education in Singapore due to the Red Scare. Consequently, the ethnic Chinese majorities in each state was forced, on the one hand, to respond to the accelerating emergence of China on the world economic and political scene, and on the other, to the ever-changing internal paradigms and differing circumstances within each site. My book attempts to map the broad changes sweeping across the Chinese-speaking world during the Cold War and illustrate the contestations these dramatists were making against their individual states' attempts that were trying to monopolize identity. These dramatists weaved together native, foreign, and Chinese elements in their theatre praxis to give voice to the local. At the same time, by performing cultural identities alternative to the ones sanctioned by their own states, they challenged the notion of a unified Chineseness. My book highlights the key role theatre and performance played in suturing identity in the diaspora and circulating people and ideas across geographical space well before cross-strait relations began to thaw. I'm sure all of you recognize Chairman Mao. And this is a slogan used during the Cultural Revolution, the 10-year political upheaval that turned the social and political order upside down and kept China isolated from the rest of the world. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, China's re-emergence on the global order propelled the discourse of Chineseness to take shape simultaneously in all four locales, which prompted the people across these sites to ask the question, who am I? In 1976, with the end of the Cultural Revolution, the people in China were reflecting on what went wrong in those 10 years. Novel techniques in artistic expression, such as scar literature and root-seeking literature, were reflecting on the turmoil caused during the decade, and thus questioned state authority and sought what it means to be a Chinese beyond the state's definition. Gao Xingjian came to prominence with 绝对信号, alarm signal, his first production at the Beijing People's Arts Theatre, Beijing Renyi, where he was resident playwright, which critics hailed as the birth of avant-garde theatre in Beijing. 车站, the bus stop, often compared to waiting for Godot, is about a group of passengers' endless wait for buses that never stop for them. Suddenly, the passengers waiting at the bus stop realize that 10 years have passed, and instead of continuing to wait, they decide to take action of their own to march to the city. The illusion of the 10-year wait could not have been missed by the avid Chinese audience who had just come out of the Cultural Revolution in the early 1980s. Because of China's isolation for most of the Cold War era, the nationalist government on Taiwan continued to represent itself as the legitimate China on the international front, although it had already lost control over the Chinese mainland since 1949. In the 1970s, Taiwan met with a series of international setbacks. China replaced Taiwan on the UN Security Council, and the US terminated diplomatic ties with Taiwan. With China's emergence from the Cultural Revolution and return to the global front, the Taiwanese needed to re-examine their own identities vis-à-vis the new geopolitical order of the contending two Chinas. Many of Stan Lai's early plays deals with this historical rupture, contemplates the epical history of this cross-strait divide, and provides critical reflection on the fragmented identity of the contemporary Taiwanese. This is Stan Lai's 8-hour epic, 如梦之梦, A Dream Like a Dream, which traverses present-day Taipei, Paris, Shanghai, Normandy, and early-day Republican Beijing. If you look closely, this performance actually takes place at the circumference of the stage. Right here in the middle of the stage, this space has been dug up, and you see little heads popping out. These are audiences seated in swiveling chairs. The performance moves around the circumference of the stage, and the audience have to turn on their revolving seats to watch the performance as it goes around them. This is Bao Bao Yicun, the village, about life in the Juan, the military dependence village. And it discusses the difficulty of the Lai Sheng-chuan, the mainland emigres settlement in Taiwan. These are the people who came from mainland China because of the war to Taiwan in 1949. And because they were outsiders, they are finding it very hard to acclimatize and settle into a new space. 那一夜我们说相声 The night we became cross-talk comedians. This is the first of Stan Lai's attempts at 相声 plays. And his signature piece, 暗恋桃花源 Secret Love in Peach Blossom Land, made of two plays, Secret Love, a romantic tragedy, and Peach Blossom Land, 桃花源, an absurdist comedy. I don't know if any of you recognizes this actress in there. Ling Qingxia, who has been an international superstar for the past 2 to 3 decades. Right, she starred in Stan Lai's plays in 1991, and this later became a film version because the stage version was so successful. Any of you recognizes this? 1997, this audience needs no introduction. Right, we see the Union Jack, we see the Chinese staff, the Chinese flag, we see the leaders, the Chinese leaders here. This was Jiang Zemin, this was Dong Jianhua, the first chief executive appointed for the new Hong Kong after the handover. Right, this side are the British leaders. According to theatre historians, Tian Penxiang and Gilbert Fong, no topic in the history of contemporary Hong Kong theatre has been given closer attention than the issue of the 1997 handover. Although the handover took place in 1997, discussions were already taking place in the early 1980s. The then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984, which promised Hong Kong's return to China in 1997. And this sent ripples throughout the entire city. Hong Kong had by then, in the early 80s, developed into a bustling financial hub and commercial center in East Asia, with its GDP ranked 3rd globally. Its cantopop and film industries had also had immense influence in the entire region, earning it the appellation Hollywood of the East. Contrasted with the motherland that had newly emerged from the Cultural Revolution, it was difficult for many Hong Kongers to imagine an impending political merger with the mainland. Therefore, an outpouring of emotional response flooded the entire society, with the question of identity fervently discussed in all forms of literary and artistic productions. For the next 15 years, leading up to the handover, an abundance of dramatic works emerged discussing the 1997 phobia. These works probed what being a Hong Konger meant in the past and what it might mean after the handover, and therefore were collectively termed the 97 plays, 97剧. This is Danny Yong, widely regarded as Hong Kong's cultural godfather. And he is renowned for pushing boundaries via his avant-garde experimental works. For example, 烈女传, Chronicle of Women, discusses the Sino-British Hong Kong relationship from a feminized position by using language with overt sexual references and vulgarities. 鸦片战争致邓小平的4封信, Opium War, 4 letters to Deng Xiaoping. From its title, it is very obvious that this play is on Hong Kong's historical identity and its future relationship with China. We saw earlier in Stanley's example where there is a different form of expression on stage, a different form of relationship between the performers and the audience. That was in the year 2000. This is 1984. Hong Kong was already doing this. If you see here, this is the stage And seated on stage are actually not the performers. These are some of the audiences that have been invited to sit on stage. This is Danny Yong here holding hands with the performers. The performers are performing down on the floor. And this is the audience, the spectatorial area. And you can see these are placards of Marx, Liu Shaoqi, and Engels. Danny Yong invited the audience to be on stage to view the position, to change the positionalities with which to view performance and theater. So he was really ahead of his times in the early 1980s. And all these dramatists I studied in the 80s were avant-garde in their own right, as when they start to break conventions of their times. Kuo Pao Kun, who is today best remembered as the father of modern Singapore theatre. Although Singapore is multi-ethnic, ever since the Iron Curtain partitioned the world into two during the Cold War, Chinese education was deemed suspicious and highly susceptible to infiltration by communist insurgents. 3/4 of the Singaporean population are ethnic Chinese, yet becoming the third China in Southeast Asia was not an option that would be tolerated in the free world. Consequently, the state clamped down on Chinese education and simultaneously elevated English as the national working language. This linguistic change adversely affected social mobility, economic opportunities, as well as intergenerational communication across the entire country. 棺材太大，洞太小. The coffin is too big for the hole. And 郑和的后代, descendants of the eunuch admiral. These play titles present a paradox. What do you do when the coffin is unable to fit the hole for which it is dug? And how can a eunuch bear progeny, even if he's all-powerful? These works by Kuo Pao Kun are all about power between the individual and the state. And this is 寻找小猫的妈妈, Mama looking for her cat. The first significant play in Singapore theatre history that comprises of a multilingual cast using 7 local languages and dialects. Beginning with Mama Looking for Her Cat, Kuo Pao Kun's hybrid multilingual plays encapsulated a holistic Singaporean experience that revolutionized the dramatic tradition in the country. His multilingual theatre was not only responding to the government's suppression of Chinese language education, he was, at the same time, lending a voice to the Chinese-educated Singaporeans who have been disenfranchised by the language policy. And this is where my book begins. On the left side here, you see this is the back cover of a book. And this book is entitled 迈向多元化戏剧第2届华语戏剧营专辑, the second Chinese drama camp. And here, it states here, this the second Chinese language drama camp from December the 30th, 1980 to January the 3rd, 1988. In a series of 5 days at the Center of Recreation for the Elders. This is where it's held, and they invited dramatists to train with locals, and amongst them from China, Mr. Yu Qiuyu, Mr. Gao Xingjian, from Taiwan, Stan Lai, and from Hong Kong, Mr. Danny Yong. So this book records that invitation, that conglomeration of these 4 dramatists who were about to become the most important artists from their regions and beyond. If you can tell, this is this man right here. This is anyone? This is Gao Xingjian. This is the man who would be the first Chinese to win the Nobel Prize in the year 2000. Okay, this is 1987. He was still not that widely known then. Stan Lai from Taiwan. Okay, this is Danny Yong. This is Danny Yong. Yu Qiuyu is right here. Yu Qiuyu is another very important cultural critic from Beijing. Singapore is often mocked as a cultural desert, a 文化沙漠. Yet the 1980s saw these four who are rising to become the most important and iconic figures in the respective cultural scenes gather in Singapore. In my book, I try to answer the question, 是英雄造时势，还是时势造英雄? Does the hero make the times, or do the times make the hero? My answer is the latter. More than making individual case studies of four disparate sites, my book draws our attention to the significant role the external impact of the Cold War played in narrating the various identities of becoming across these states into the same temporality, which transpire into very different socio-political local histories. I explore the emergence of these prominent artists in the 1980s, when identity seeking was a major theme in all of the respective localities. It presents a circuit of transnational Chinese creativity that differs substantially from that assumed by conventional literary history centered on the Chinese mainland. In particular, I focus on the problem of Chineseness, arguing that these dramatists share an interest in problematizing essentialist notions of Chinese identity. And that was the beginning of my book. This is the conclusion of my book. This is a quote from Professor Liu Fan, who was originally at Harvard and now has retired in Hong Kong. Writing in the special issue, The Living Tree, The Changing Meaning of Being Chinese Today, of the journal Daedalus in 1991, Professor Liu Li must have then found it impossible to imagine a Chinese Joseph Brodsky, the Soviet poet in exile in the United States and winner of the 1987 Nobel Prize in Literature, someone who writes in both his native language and the language of his adopted country in order to create an art that transcends national boundaries. I argue in my book that we have found not one, but four Chinese writers who are deserving to enter the illustrious world, the illustrious hall of world theater. This is a quote from Kuo Pao Kun, one of the four dramatists I study. He's talking about these transcendental and uncertain life experiences that he has, and I argue which the other three dramatists share as well. Marginal in the sense that you're at the margins of different cultures, different communities. Some people stay with the mentality of a particular time and they don't change. But if you mix with different kinds of people, you find yourself moving between the margins of different periods. That kind of marginality, a fringe kind of existence, allows one to compare and to reflect. Because you don't belong to any one of those times, you know? Sometimes you feel a sort of loneliness because you are different. But also you feel good because you're able to dialogue, to talk, to communicate with very unique groups of people who think differently and have different experiences. To varying degrees, the lives of these dramatists that were anything but constant instilled in them a marginal consciousness. From an early age, they were already crossing borders from culture to culture and moving in between cultures, exploring the marginal spaces in between cultures. This constant state of liminality forbade them the comfort of fixity. Instead, these became spaces of creativity that made available for them different cultures and resources to mix and synthesize, immersing them in a constant state of hybridization and experimentation. The periphery was as much a space from which they were critiquing Chinese culture as they were borrowing other cultural resources to experiment with, enrich, and pluralize Chineseness. Adopting a reflective marginal consciousness allowed these dramatists to constantly disidentify with the state's definition of Chineseness. Being on the diaspora of Chinese culture positioned them to destabilize constructed paradigms, unsettle power relations, and denationalize identities. So that was the overarching theme in my book. This is the table of contents for chapter 1. The title for chapter 1 is Articulating an Alternative Cultural Identity, Kuo Pao Kun's Multilingual Theatre Praxis in Singapore. So I have 6 chapters in the book, an introduction and conclusion, 4 body chapters, 1 body chapter for each site. Okay, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. This is how the Singapore chapter looks like. We introduce the question of the problem, identifying one problem, and then I go back to the times before the 1980s to talk about the rise of a local consciousness, the rise of a local identity, and what other groups attempted to do before the 80s to get to that same localization theme. And then I pick one play in each site and I analyze it in detail and I give a conclusion. So this is the basic structure of all my body chapters. And now I will go into into chapter 1. Okay, and before we do that, let's hear a song.
这里是新加坡，我哋喺海山街住過。1941年轰炸機經過，一枚炸彈在街頭降落。我們這裡是新加坡，我阿媽喺的卡上我，雖然那時候霸王車很多，她卻依然騎單車去工作。我們這裡是新加坡，我的童年在女皇鎮過。一方半亭的竹背後，小小的林子裡，曾經是孩子們的窩。我們這裡是新加坡，我的小學從前在小坡。平時不讀書，考試之前跑到四馬路的廟前，說聲阿彌陀佛。我們這裡是新加坡，我們都曾一無所有過，現在擁有的不算什麼，但是比別人珍惜得多。我們這裡是新加坡，我表兄金沙回來咯，小小麻雀擔竹枝，都係擔返屋企好得多。我們這裡是新加坡，我的童年在女皇鎮過。一方半亭的竹背後，小小的林子裡。
What's the main content? What do you hear?
The history of Singapore.
Say again. Song is about Singapore.
The history of
The
Singapore.
history of Singapore. What about the history of Singapore?
When it was still poor.
When it's still poor. Anything else?
The uniqueness of being a Singapore person.
The uniqueness of being in Singaporean, but the history of Singapore. Okay, what else? What else? There was the war, people were poor, but we survived. Anything else? There's this little bird, there's a little sparrow. Talking about this little sparrow bringing twigs to build a nest. This is a song about home building, nation building. It's about sense of belonging. It's about local identity. This is the song we've just heard. It's called 麻雀衔竹枝, 麻雀衔竹枝, little bird, little sparrow with twigs. And this song, this is 联合早报, the online version. 联合早报 is the main Chinese newspaper in Singapore today. And this is dated 2013, August 2nd. And this headline reads, this song, Bamboo with Twigs by Mr. Liang Wenfu, has been banned for 23 years. It's now unbanned. Imagine there's a song about nation building, about home, about identity, banned for 23 years, right? There's nothing seditious about the song. Why was this song banned for so long?
The language they use.
The language they used. The song was largely in Mandarin, and there were but 因为歌词中的几句方言被禁23年 there were a couple of lines in Hokkien and a few lines in Cantonese. And this was enough for the song to be banned for 23 years. Mr. Liang Wenfu is now a cultural medallion. So he's very famous in Singapore today. Liang Wenfu is now, his name is synonymous with the Xinyao, known as the Singaporean ballads movement, which is a genre created in the 1980s to celebrate the lives and vibrancy of the young nation, eager then to seek its own identity. So this song was banned for 23 years for the use of non-standard language in Singapore. So this is the problem I identified at the beginning of chapter 1, and then I'm going to explain the politics of language in Singapore. Okay, the Singaporean Chinese then and today still is about 75%, 3/4 of the country. And most of the Singaporeans, Singapore is here. Most of the Singaporean Chinese traditionally come from the southeastern coast of China here. You can see Xiamen, Shantou, Guangzhou, and the dialects we speak. Hokkien, mainly Hokkien speakers, and it's known as Minanhua, Fujianhua, Taiyu, same language. Chaozhouhua, which is what I speak, and Cantonese is the third biggest dialect. While the ban on dialects and the use of multiple languages were only lifted in the music scene in 2013, the theatre circle already overcame this barrier in 1988 with the play 寻找小猫的妈妈, Mama Looking for Her Cat by Kuo Pao Kun. In this devised ensemble piece, Kuo Pao Kun has integrated multiple languages and dialects, English, Mandarin, Tamil, Hokkien, Cantonese, and Teochew, in the same text to capture the cultural syncretism and linguistic pluralism of Singapore. One scholar commented that in this play, Kuo Pao Kun has come to epitomize the quintessential Singaporean in his increasingly instrumental role as a mediator between the hitherto polarized streams of Singapore theatre. Now, what were these different streams in Singapore theatre, and why were they hitherto polarized? Widely regarded as Singapore's most important dramatist to date, Kuo Pao Kun is an avid theatre practitioner who was originally only active in Chinese language stream. He proceeded in the 1980s to conduct workshops and write plays in English, as well as develop a multilingual dramatic praxis that has since become the definitive model of the Singaporean theatre. As a result, all the major artists in both the current English and Chinese language theatre circles have been nurtured under his influence. What might be lesser known is that this man was hailed as the father of modern Singapore drama, one who single-handedly crafted the shape of contemporary Singapore's theatre scene, was not some kind of cultural czar appointed by the government. Quite to the contrary, Kuo Pao Kun was incarcerated for 4.5 years by the state for leaning too much to the left in the mid-1970s. We can take Kuo Pao Kun's incarceration as an important turning point in the development of Singapore's language policies. Critics generally recognized the division of Singaporean society at large before the 1980s into different language streams, namely Chinese, English, Malay, and Tamil, as a result of the colonial government's separate and rural policy. When the Singaporean government succeeded the British in 1959, they sought to encourage the building of modern Singaporean society through multi-racialism, wherein the 4 major ethnic groups were given, quote-unquote, separate but equal status. Indeed, the different language streams in Singapore theatre before the 1980s was also noticeably divided into these different languages. And chief among Kuo Pao Kun's many contributions to the arts is perhaps as having become the bridge builder between these language streams. At a time where drama practitioners and audiences of different language streams hardly mixed, and the development of theatre within each community was generally not known to members of the other communities, Kuo Pao Kun's crossing of the linguistic boundaries is a significant step in establishing a holistic translingual theatre community and developing a multilingual theatre praxis. This is the state's idea of a multiracial construct of Singapore, manifested in this CIMO model. According to what has now been called a multiracial model, the governance is divided along such ethnic lines, with 4 designated official languages that correspond with these groups respectively. So the state not only defines your ethnicity, it also defines the languages that you speak. So Singapore's racial or ethnic makeup has been like this, largely unchanged for the past 60 years since it became independent, with the Chinese always visibly the significant bigger group. Yet, many Chinese Singaporeans are not very erudite in Chinese language and culture, and these have very specific historical causes, which I will go into later. Remember that before the 1980s, theatre practitioners and audiences of different language streams hardly mixed. This meant that despite the country's multilingual reality, the plays that were performed on stage were often monolingual. In my book, I discuss attempts by other dramatists to stage their versions of a multilingual reality and Singaporeanness. But it was only in 1988 that Kuo Pao Kun's Mama Looking for Her Cat created a milestone in Singapore's multilingual theatre history. The play consisted of actors from different ethnicities and language streams perform in their respective 7 native tongues. But more importantly, this play drew audiences from different language streams and ethnic groups into the same spectatorial space, a space where audiences have come collectively to watch what they have identified as their own play. This is a scene at the end of the play, where standing in the middle of the performance is Kuo Pao Kun, and seated behind him are the actors. He's doing a Q&A with the audience after the performance, and he's translating back and forth in Chinese and English. You can see that this play is not done on the traditional proscenium arch theatre where the stage is raised. This stage is on the ground, and it's theatre in the black box theatre performed to all 3 sides. Right, this is done so that they are in very close contact with the audience, so that they can impact them at close range. You can't tell from this angle, but seated amongst the audience are people from very different backgrounds. And just in case you're wondering, the title of the play, Mama Looking for Her Cat, doesn't sound like high register English. This is deliberate. It was intended to sound more colloquial, more Singlish, so as to bring in Singaporeans who are not native speakers of English into the theatre. Then one might ask, why would one be creating monolingual plays in a multilingual reality? And why did Kuo Pao Kun choose to cross this divide? Because Singapore has 4 official languages. They do not enjoy a separate but equal status. Before Kuo Pao Kun's incarceration, he was not known to the English drama community, having produced plays only in Chinese, even though Kuo Pao Kun was effectively bilingual. Kuo was born in China, and he moved to Singapore when he was 10 and undertook professional theatre training in the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney, before returning to Singapore to found his own theatre company, the Singapore Performing Arts Studio, Singapore 表演艺术学院, in 1965, the year that Singapore was separated from Malaysia and declared independent. The Chinese language theatre in Singapore had traditionally always been active, with a strong social and political consciousness partly inherited from the Chinese May 4th movement. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were using the Chinese language as a mode of literary and artistic expression, Kuo Pao Kun treaded too close to politics and was imprisoned during a mass arrest that targeted left-leaning writers, intellectuals, and political figures. Upon his release in 1980, the ground had shifted tremendously. the government had implemented an education policy of great consequence, elevating English as the national first working language and relegating all mother tongues to second language status. English was chosen as the main working language so as to establish a common language of communication amongst this linguistically and culturally diverse people, as well as to expedite the young nation's post-independence entry into the world of international commerce. Then, post-war Southeast Asia was going through a volatile episode in the 1960s and 70s, with the emergence of national self-rule on the one hand and the threat of communist insurgents on the other. In the midst of the Cold War, the Singaporean government saw Chinese education as highly suspect of serving as a breeding ground for communism, and hence in 1979 implemented an education policy of great consequence that had a dramatic effect on Chinese language education. All the Chinese medium schools were closed and reopened as nationalized English stream schools. Perhaps most ironic of all was this Speak Mandarin campaign, 讲华语运动. The campaign was not, in fact, aimed at increasing one's Chinese cultural literacy. Instead, it was targeted to discourage the use of dialects and encourage the Chinese ethnics to adopt Mandarin. Coupled with the government's bilingual education policy that saw an elevation of the status of English, the Chinese cultural literacy among Singaporeans has in fact declined significantly over the years. This education policy of great consequence altered the social and consequently economic status of the different linguistic groups. For those who were educated in Chinese stream schools, they had to literally make the switch overnight to study all their classes in English. The reality for many was being forced out of the public school system because they could not master enough English simply to keep up with the curriculum. In the workplace, due to a lesser proficiency in English, Chinese educated Singaporeans often encounter difficulties in finding jobs or have greater difficulty moving up the social hierarchy. For the Chinese drama scene, the most direct consequences of this policy was that it effectively ended the supply of talent, both practitioners and potential audiences, from going into theatre. Next, we will hear a song that was used to promote the Speak Mandarin campaign.
要进步，语言要沟通，就从今天。
Okay, for those who understand Chinese, the first line of the song, 国家要进步, the country needs to improve, and the second line, 语言要沟通, language, the purpose of language is to communicate. So suddenly, language and nation are bound uncritically together. And with that, Kuo Pao Kun ventured to write plays and taught drama workshops in English. His move into English theatre attracted an entirely new group of potential practitioners who would otherwise not have come in touch with Chinese theatre due to the language barriers that traditionally separated these two groups. Owing to Kuo Pao Kun's efforts, he was able to adopt and introduce the resources of both groups to each other, opening up his vision of multilingualism. In some ways, Kuo Pao Kun was forced to open up this space with English language theatre practitioners because the government's language policy dealt such a heavy blow to Chinese education in general and Chinese theatre in particular that they could never quite recover from. Official decisions that were made during this period, which resulted in the eventual disappearance of Chinese language education, are now generally recognized as a major cause of the steep decline in Chinese language standard and the shrinking of all fields related to the language. This play, Mama Looking for a Cat, dramatizes the increasing distance between an aged mother, Mama, crouched in the middle, and her children due to Singapore's changing language policies. Mama is monolingual and can only speak the Chinese dialect Hokkien, and since dialects are discouraged from use in school and banned altogether, her children have acquired only a very weak grasp of the dialect. And as such, through a cultural change in school and society, the children find it hard to communicate and become impatient with their mama, and this drives her to seek solace with the pet cat. One day, her cat goes missing and she goes out in search for it. Outside, Mama meets an old Indian man who too is looking for his cat. Both being monolingual speakers, the Tamil-speaking man and the Hokkien-speaking Mama are unable to understand each other's words. However, through physical enactments, they seem to establish a camaraderie beyond the linguistic register, enacting what was possibly the single most moving scene of human interaction in all of Singapore theatre. Each understands that the other is looking for the lost cat, and both realize that their cats are banished from their homes by their children. And once the Indian man's cat is found, he invites his new friend to play with it. Eventually, as Mama and the Indian man part ways unwillingly, they may have reached an understanding that they are both marginalized figures in this new language policy that enshrines the predominance of English speakers. Like the characters in the play, the audience too experiences the frustration and alienation of multilingual exchanges. Remember here that the play took place in 7 languages, so no matter how linguistically talented you are, there will be bound to be some languages that you miss. So Kuo Pao Kun here is using theatre as a space for intervention to call on his audience to reflect on the possibilities and imaginings of the scenarios and outcomes by making them experience firsthand the characters' frustrations on the other side of the fence of the language policy. Assuming that the majority of the audience has consisted of the middle class, tertiary educated, and intellectuals, the play's alienation strategy has allowed them a chance to think and feel for those who are less empowered and occupy an even less privileged social position, such as Mama. It is with his multilingual plays that Kuo Pao Kun has created an alternative to the state-sanctioned multiracial model in 1980s Singapore, which had by then achieved a decade of economic progress and was seeking to establish its own cultural identity. In contrast to the state's simplistic celebration of the country's diverse ethnicities by awarding each ethnic group token representation, Kuo Pao Kun's multilingual theatre opens a critical space to reflect on the issues surrounding the multiracial construct and deconstruct the hierarchies that veil such power structures, thereby exposing the relationships between the different linguistic communities to indeed be separate, and yet is anything but equal. At a time when all fields related to the Chinese language have been steeply declining, Kuo Pao Kun was a trailblazer who incorporated and utilized resources from other language spheres and carved out an entirely new space for Chinese theatre. Perhaps some might not agree that the plays Kuo Pao Kun was writing could still be considered Chinese language. Significantly, it is owing to Kuo's timely intervention that theatre in Singapore did not entirely become English language, but instead, multilingualism came to be accepted as a genuine reflection of Singaporeanness. In a place like Singapore, where English has become the dominant language in most of society, it is hard to imagine a theatre scene that would be otherwise. I would argue that Kuo Pao Kun's works reflect the socio-political conditions the ethnic Chinese were going through in the 1980s, and are what I would call Chinese language theatre in Singapore becoming Singaporean Chinese language theatre. one that distinguished itself from the theatres in other Chinese-speaking regions. Importantly, Kuo Pao Kun's theatre practice resisted the Singaporean state's effort to pigeonhole its citizens into particular ethnic groupings and instead performed a Singaporean cultural identity into being. Thank you. If you're interested, this book is on sale, and if you scan this QR code, you get a 30% discount.